Julia Roberts thought her late-night walk in the rain would be a quiet escape, a moment of peace away from the chaos of fame. But when she heard the frantic barking of a puppy trapped in a flooded alley, everything changed. What started as a simple act of kindness quickly unraveled into a battle against nightmarish creatures, mysterious breaches, and a shadowy corporation behind it all. With only her wits, a brave puppy named Max, and an unlikely group of allies, Julia must uncover the truth about the breaches before they spread further. As danger looms and the stakes rise, she discovers that the puppy she saved might be the key to saving everyone. Can Julia shut down the machines before it's too late? Or will the unleashed forces consume everything in their path? The journey begins with a single act of courage, and leads to an adventure she never imagined. The rain fell steadily, washing over the quiet streets and filling the air with the faint scent of wet asphalt. Julia tugged her hoodie tighter over her head, her breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. The streets were nearly empty, with only the soft glow of streetlights reflecting on the slick pavement to keep her company. These late-night walks had become a ritual for her, a moment to escape the endless demands of fame, the noise of the world, and the whirlwind of cameras and questions. Here she could simply be Julia, not the pop star or the celebrity, but just a person who needed to clear her mind. The rhythmic splashes of her boots in shallow puddles provided a soothing rhythm, her thoughts beginning to settle. But then, cutting through the calming patter of rain, came a sound that froze her mid-step. It was a bark, high-pitched, sharp, and desperate. Julia stopped, tilting her head toward the sound. It came again, echoing faintly from a dark alley up ahead. She glanced around, the empty street offering no clues. "Hello," she called softly, her voice carried away by the rain. The barking continued, frantic and insistent. Curiosity and concern gnawed at her. She hesitated, glancing toward the narrow alley. It was dark, the kind of place her bodyguard would have told her to avoid at all costs. But something in that bark pulled at her heart. It wasn't just a dog barking, it was a cry for help. With a sigh, Julia adjusted her hoodie and stepped cautiously toward the alley. The closer she got, the louder the barking became, echoing off the brick walls. Rainwater streamed down the alley, pulling into a small, fast-moving current that carried bits of trash and debris. Shadows danced in the dim light, making it hard to see anything clearly. She stopped just at the mouth of the alley, peering into the darkness. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. A sharp bark answered her. Taking a deep breath, Julia stepped into the alley. The air was colder here, the rainwater splashing against her shoes as she moved carefully over the slick ground. The barking was closer now, more frantic, and as she rounded a corner she saw it. A small puppy was trapped on a piece of floating wood, caught against a pile of debris in the rising water. Its fur was soaked, clinging to its trembling body, and its wide, terrified eyes locked onto hers as it barked and whined. Julia's heart clenched. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, crouching slightly to get a better look. The rain poured harder, and the water around the puppy started to rise, shifting the debris pile. The makeshift raft wobbled dangerously, and the puppy let out a sharp yelp. "Hang on, I'm coming," Julia said, stepping forward. The water was colder than she expected, soaking through her shoes and jeans as she waded in. The current wasn't deep, but it was strong enough to make every step feel unsteady. Julia used her free hand to steady herself against the wall as she moved closer to the trembling puppy. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice soothing. "I'm here to help you." The puppy stopped barking for a moment, watching her with wide, frightened eyes. It seemed to sense her intentions but still trembled as the water rose higher. When Julia finally reached the debris pile, she crouched down, ignoring the cold water splashing around her knees. "Come here, little one," she said gently, extending her arms. The puppy hesitated, its tiny paws gripping the unstable piece of wood. For a moment it looked like it might back away, but then it took a shaky step forward. "That's it," Julia encouraged. "You're doing great." With one quick motion, she scooped up the puppy, cradling it against her chest. It was smaller than she'd realized, its wet fur sticking to her jacket as it whimpered softly. "There we go," she murmured, standing up. "You're safe now." The puppy trembled in her arms but didn't struggle. Its small head pressed against her shoulder, and Julia felt a flicker of relief. But just as she turned to leave the alley, the puppy let out a sharp bark. It squirmed in her arms, twisting to look back toward the deeper part of the alley. "What's wrong?" Julia asked, frowning. The puppy barked again, more insistent this time. It seemed to be pointing her toward something, its small paws pressing against her arm as it strained to see further into the shadows. Julia hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. The rain and darkness made it hard to see, but there was something about the puppy's behavior that sent a chill down her spine. "What are you trying to show me?" she murmured. The puppy barked again, wriggling as if urging her to follow. Julia sighed, adjusting her grip on the dog. She should leave. She'd done her part, hadn't she? But the way the puppy was acting made her pause. "Okay, fine," she said softly, stepping further into the alley. "Let's see what this is about." The rain poured harder, and the water around her swirled faster as Julia ventured deeper into the alley, unaware of what lay ahead. The alley grew darker as Julia moved deeper, the rain pouring down in relentless sheets. Water sloshed around her ankles, growing colder with each step. The puppy barked softly in her arms, wriggling just enough to guide her without trying to jump down. "Easy, little one," Julia murmured. "I can't see much in this rain." The air felt heavier here, and the faint glow of the streetlights behind her barely reached this far into the narrow space. Trash floated lazily in the rushing water, old cans, soggy boxes, and bits of plastic. The alley was alive with the sound of rain and the gurgling of water as it fought to find its way to the drains. The puppy barked again, sharper this time, its small body twisting in her arms. Julia stopped, narrowing her eyes as she tried to peer ahead. "What is it?" she asked softly, her breath puffing in the cold air. A sound reached her, soft at first, almost swallowed by the rain. It wasn't barking, though. It was more like a faint whimper, high-pitched and weak. Julia's stomach clenched. Was there another animal trapped in the flood? She quickened her pace, careful not to slip on the slick ground as the water rose higher, now lapping at her calves. The alley twisted sharply, and as Julia rounded the corner, her breath caught. In the dim light, she saw what the puppy had been leading her to. A small metal cage was wedged against a pile of debris, half submerged in the rushing water. Inside the cage, 2 more puppies huddled together, their tiny bodies pressed against the bars as the water climbed higher around them. Their fur was soaked, and their soft cries cut straight through Julia's heart. "Oh my God," she whispered, moving toward them. The puppy in her arms barked, struggling to wriggle free. Julia crouched down, placing it gently on the ground. It shook itself off and immediately ran to the cage, barking and pawing at the bars as if to urge her to hurry. "I see them," Julia said, her voice trembling slightly. The cage was stuck tight, wedged between a wooden pallet and a rusted pipe. Julia knelt in the rising water, her hands slipping as she tried to grab the cage. The metal was cold and slick, and the current fought against her every movement. "Hang on, little ones," she murmured, gripping the cage firmly. "I've got you." The puppies inside whined, their tiny noses pressing against the bars as the water crept closer to them. Julia gritted her teeth, pulling harder. The cage shifted slightly but refused to budge. "Come on," she muttered, planting her feet against the slippery ground. The puppy she had rescued barked again, circling her as if to encourage her. Julia couldn't help but smile, even as her arms burned from the effort. "I'm trying, okay? Just give me a second." With one final heave, the cage came free, the debris pile collapsing into the water with a loud splash. Julia stumbled backward, catching herself just before she fell. "Got it," she said, her voice breathless. She quickly pulled the cage toward her, fumbling with the latch. The puppies scrambled out as soon as the door opened, their tiny bodies shivering as they huddled together beside her. The first puppy joined them, licking their faces and barking excitedly. Julia smiled despite the cold and exhaustion. "You're welcome," she said softly, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. But before she could stand, the puppy barked again, this time with a sharp urgency that made her freeze. "What now?" Julia asked, her smile fading. The puppy darted toward the far end of the alley, its tail stiff and its ears pinned back. It stopped after a few steps, looking over its shoulder and barking at her again. Julia frowned. "You're kidding," she muttered. The rain poured harder, and the water continued to rise. Julia could feel it pulling at her legs, threatening to sweep her off balance. She glanced at the 2 rescued puppies, who were huddled together near her feet, and then at the first puppy, who seemed determined to keep leading her further. "Fine," Julia said, standing and wiping her wet hands on her jacket. "But this is the last time, okay?" The puppy barked once, then took off toward the end of the alley. Julia sighed, scooping up the 2 smaller puppies and tucking them into the crook of her arm. The water splashed around her as she followed. The alley narrowed as it curved again, the walls closing in. Julia's nerves prickled. It felt like the rain was getting louder, the shadows deeper. Ahead, the puppy stopped, barking furiously at a pile of debris blocking a small doorway. Julia approached cautiously, her pulse quickening. The puppy scratched at the pile, its movements frantic. "What is it this time?" she murmured, crouching to inspect the mess. The pile was a jumble of broken wood, trash bags, and loose bricks, all pressed against the doorway by the floodwaters. Julia set the puppies down gently beside her, their tiny bodies huddling together for warmth. She reached for the debris, her fingers digging into the slippery mess. It was heavy and awkward, but something about the puppy's insistence kept her going. "You got to be the bravest dog I've ever met," Julia said, glancing at the puppy. It barked again, its tail wagging despite the urgency in its movements. Piece by piece, Julia cleared the debris, her hands aching from the cold and effort. She paused to catch her breath, her ears straining against the rain. That's when she heard it, a muffled cry from behind the door. Her breath caught. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. "Hello," she called out, her voice rising. "Is someone in there?" A faint, shaky voice responded, "Help, please." Julia's heart raced. She turned to the puppy, whose bark seemed almost triumphant now. "You're something else," she whispered, then turned back to the pile. With renewed urgency, Julia tore at the debris, throwing pieces aside until the doorway was clear enough to push open. Inside, huddled against the far wall, was a young girl, no older than 10, clutching a soaked backpack to her chest. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she stared up at Julia with wide, tear-filled eyes. "It's okay," Julia said softly, stepping inside. "I'm here to help." The puppy barked once more, wagging its tail as it trotted confidently into the room. Julia crouched in the doorway, her heart pounding as she took in the sight of the trembling girl huddled against the far wall. The dim light from the alley barely illuminated the small room, but it was enough for Julia to see the fear etched on the girl's face. "It's okay," Julia said gently, trying to keep her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "You're safe now." The girl didn't move, her grip tightening on the soaked backpack in her arms. She looked past Julia, her wide eyes locking onto the puppy, who trotted toward her with an almost triumphant air. The puppy barked softly, wagging its tail as it reached the girl, nosing at her knees. Slowly, the girl's shoulders relaxed, her trembling fingers reaching out to touch the wet, scrappy fur. Julia smiled, her relief mingling with curiosity. "Is this your dog?" she asked softly. The girl nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, his name is Max." "Max," Julia repeated, glancing at the brave little dog. "Well, Max did an amazing job leading me here." The girl's lips quivered as she tried to speak. I got stuck when the water came. I didn't know where to go. Max ran out, and I thought he'd left me," but her voice broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. Julia moved closer, careful not to startle her. "He didn't leave you," she said gently. "He was looking for help, and he found me." The girl sniffled, wiping her face with her sleeve. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Let's get you out of here," Julia said, glancing at the rising water outside. It was climbing higher, seeping into the room and pooling around their feet. The girl nodded, her movements sluggish as she tried to stand. Julia quickly reached out to steady her, her arms wrapping around the small, shivering frame. "I've got you," she said. Max barked, running to the door and wagging his tail as if urging them to hurry. Julia turned to the two other puppies, who were still huddled by the doorway. "We're not leaving you behind," she murmured, scooping them up before leading the girl toward the exit. The water outside was higher than before, swirling in dangerous currents that threatened to sweep them off their feet. Julia gritted her teeth, holding the girl tightly with one arm while balancing the puppies in the other. "Stay close to me," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. Max darted ahead, splashing through the water with surprising agility, his bark sharp and encouraging. Julia followed his lead, her steps cautious as she navigated the slippery ground. The girl clung to her side, her small fingers gripping Julia's jacket. "It's so deep," she whispered, her voice shaky. "We'll make it," Julia said firmly, though her own nerves were on edge. The current tugged at her legs with every step, but she refused to let it slow her down. As they reached the end of the alley, the water surged suddenly, pushing debris into their path. A large piece of wood floated toward them, its jagged edges threatening to knock them off balance. "Watch out," Julia said, pulling the girl back just in time. Max barked furiously, darting toward the wood and shoving it aside with his small body. Julia stared in disbelief as the little dog continued to clear the path, barking and nudging debris out of the way. "You're unbelievable," she muttered, her admiration for Max growing with each second. Finally, they emerged from the alley, the open street offering a brief sense of relief. The water was still high, but it was calmer here, the current less dangerous. Julia spotted a nearby awning that provided some shelter from the relentless rain. "Let's rest here for a minute," she said, guiding the girl toward the dry spot. As they sat down, Julia pulled off her jacket, wrapping it around the girl's shoulders. "There," she said softly, "that should keep you warm for now." The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on Max, who had returned to her side and was licking her hands affectionately. "You're very lucky to have him," Julia said with a smile. "He's braver than most people I know." The girl's lips curved into a small smile. "He's my best friend." Julia leaned back, letting herself breathe for the first time since she'd entered the alley. But just as she began to relax, Max barked again, his small body stiffening as he faced the direction they had come from. "What now?" Julia muttered, following his gaze. Her heart sank as she saw the water rising even faster, the debris swirling more violently. Something about the way it moved sent a chill down her spine. "Stay here," she said, glancing at the girl. "I'll be right back." The girl's eyes widened. "You're going back?" Julia hesitated, her instincts warring with her logic, but something about the way Max barked made her decision clear. "I need to make sure there's no one else stuck," she said, standing and adjusting her grip on the puppies. "Max thinks there's something else back there." The girl clutched Julia's sleeve. "Be careful," she whispered. Julia nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I will." Max barked again, already leading the way back toward the flooded alley. Julia sighed, glancing at the puppies before following him. "You're really not going to let me rest, are you?" The little dog didn't respond, its focus entirely on whatever danger lay ahead. Julia followed Max back toward the flooded alley, her steps slower this time as exhaustion began to creep in. The rain poured harder, the water now up to her knees, and every step felt like a battle against the current. "Max, where are you taking me?" she muttered, clutching the two rescue puppies close to her chest. Max barked sharply, stopping at a pile of debris near the center of the alley. The swirling water had gathered trash, broken wood, and loose bricks into a tangled mess. Max began pawing at it furiously, his small frame trembling with urgency. Julia hesitated, her instincts telling her that whatever lay beneath the debris wasn't going to be pleasant. But she couldn't ignore Max's determination. "All right," she said softly, stepping closer. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." She set the puppies down on a higher ledge where the water couldn't reach them and crouched beside Max. The debris was heavy and slippery, and every piece she moved sent a fresh wave of water splashing around her. "What are we looking for?" she asked, glancing at Max, who barked again, his nose pressed against a gap in the debris. Julia pulled away a large piece of wood, her breath hitching as the water beneath it swirled violently. Beneath the tangled mess, she caught a glimmer of something metallic. "What is that?" she murmured, reaching into the murky water. Her fingers closed around something cold and smooth, and she tugged hard, pulling it free. As she held it up, she realized it was a locked metal box, its surface battered and scratched but still intact. Max barked excitedly, wagging his tail as he pawed at the box. "What's so important about this?" Julia asked, turning it over in her hands. The box was heavy, and the lock looked old but sturdy. She glanced around the alley, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. Why was this box buried here? And why was Max so determined to find it? Before she could examine it further, a loud crashing noise echoed from the far end of the alley. Julia froze, her heart pounding as she turned toward the sound. The debris pile she cleared earlier had shifted again, the current pulling at the remaining pieces. But that wasn't what caught her attention. In the distance, she saw movement, shadows darting through the water, too quick and too large to be debris. Max growled low, his small body tensing as he took a step forward. "Max, no," Julia whispered, clutching the box tightly. She reached for the puppies, tucking them back into her arms as she slowly backed away. The shadows moved closer, and for a brief moment Julia caught a glimpse of something she couldn't explain. It was sleek and dark, its shape twisting unnaturally as it moved through the water. Her breath caught. "What is that?" Max barked furiously, his voice echoing off the alley walls. The shadows seemed to respond, shifting direction and moving toward them with alarming speed. Julia turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet ground as she splashed through the rising water. Max followed close behind, his barks growing sharper as the shadows closed in. Come on," Julia muttered, her arms aching from carrying the puppies and the box. The exit to the alley was in sight, but the water was deeper here, slowing her down. Behind her, the shadows surged closer, their movements unnatural and erratic. She didn't dare look back, her focus locked on the faint glow of the streetlights ahead. Max darted ahead, barking furiously as he reached the open street. Julia followed, stumbling onto the pavement just as a deafening crash echoed behind her. She turned, her chest heaving, and saw the debris pile collapsing into the water, the shadows vanishing beneath the surface. For a moment, the only sound was the rain and her own ragged breathing. Max barked once, sharply, drawing her attention. He stood a few feet away, his tail wagging as he nudged the box with his nose. Julia sank to her knees, setting the puppies down beside Max. Her fingers trembled as she placed the box on the ground, staring at it with a mix of confusion and unease. "What's in here, Max?" she whispered. The dog barked again, his sharp eyes fixed on the lock. Julia glanced at the girl under the awning in the distance, still huddled safely with the rescued puppies. She had a choice, leave the box and walk away, or find out what Max had risked so much to uncover. Taking a deep breath, Julia stood, cradling the box in her arms. "Let's figure this out," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. Max wagged his tail, following her as they walked back toward the awning, the mystery of the box weighing heavily in her hands. Julia returned to the awning where the young girl was waiting with the rescue puppies. The girl's face lit up when she saw Max bounding toward her, his tail wagging furiously. "You're back," the girl exclaimed, hugging Max tightly. Julia managed a smile, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She placed the metal box on the ground, the weight of its mystery pressing heavily on her. "Julia, what's that?" the girl asked, her eyes darting to the scratched, locked box. Julia knelt beside the girl, brushing damp hair out of her face. "Max led me to it," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I don't know what's inside, but it must be important if he wanted me to find it." The girl frowned, her small hands gripping Max's wet fur. "Why would someone leave a box in the water like that?" Julia shook her head. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." But before Julia could inspect the box further, a loud rumble echoed through the street. Her head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the water level rising even faster. The rain poured relentlessly, the storm showing no signs of letting up. The debris floating in the flood was more dangerous now. Larger pieces of wood, metal, and even entire trash cans were being swept down the streets. The once calm currents had turned into violent surges, and the water was climbing higher by the second. "We can't stay here," Julia said, her voice firm. She grabbed the box, holding it under one arm, and reached for the girl's hand. "We need to get to higher ground." The girl nodded, her wide eyes filled with fear. Julia scooped up the 2 rescue puppies, and Max barked once, as if to confirm the urgency. They stepped out into the storm, the water now swirling around Julia's knees. Every step felt unsteady, the current threatening to pull them off balance. "Stay close to me," Julia said, gripping the girl's hand tightly. Max led the way, his small body navigating the water with surprising ease. His barks were sharp and purposeful, guiding Julia and the girl around the largest obstacles. But as they rounded a corner, Julia stopped short. A large piece of debris, a shattered wooden pallet tangled with metal scraps, blocked the road ahead. The current had jammed it against a streetlight, forming a dam that caused the water to pool dangerously high. "We can't go that way," Julia muttered, scanning for another path. Max barked sharply, his tail stiff as he darted toward an alley on their right. He stopped at the entrance, barking again and wagging his tail as if urging them to follow. Julia hesitated. The alley looked narrow and dark, the kind of place she'd normally avoid. But the floodwaters were rising fast, and the main road was no longer an option. "Okay, Max," she said, her voice steady. "We'll follow you." The girl clung tightly to Julia as they waded into the alley, the water reaching Julia's thighs now. The puppies whimpered softly in her arms, their small bodies shivering against the cold. As they moved deeper into the alley, the sound of rushing water grew louder, echoing off the walls. Julia's pulse quickened. Something about this felt wrong. "Max," she called softly. "Are you sure about this?" The dog barked in response, his small frame pushing forward with determination. But then Julia froze. A sharp, splintering sound echoed through the alley, followed by a deafening crash. She turned just in time to see the debris dam on the main road give way, sending a massive wave of water surging toward them. "Run," Julia shouted, her voice breaking through the roar of the flood. Max took off, barking furiously as he led the way. Julia held the girl's hand tightly, pushing through the rising water with every ounce of strength she had. The wave hit them like a wall, knocking Julia off balance. She stumbled, her grip on the girl slipping for a terrifying moment before she caught her again. The box slipped from her grasp, tumbling into the swirling water, but Max leaped after it, his small body diving into the current. "Max!" the girl screamed, tears streaming down her face. Julia pulled the girl closer, forcing her legs to move against the pull of the water. "He'll be okay," she shouted, though her own heart ached with worry. The wave pushed them closer to the alley's exit, where the water was slightly calmer. Julia stumbled onto higher ground, dragging the girl with her. For a moment, everything was a blur, the pounding rain, the rushing water, and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then she heard it, a familiar bark. "Max!" the girl cried, her face lighting up. Julia turned to see Max bounding toward them, the box clamped firmly in his jaws. He was soaked and shivering, but his tail wagged furiously as he reached them. "You little hero," Julia murmured, scooping Max up and hugging him tightly. The girl joined in, wrapping her arms around both Julia and Max. "I was so scared," she whispered. "You did great," Julia said softly, her voice trembling with relief. "Both of you." As the storm raged on, Julia looked down at the box in Max's jaws. Whatever was inside, it had to be important. And now, more than ever, she was determined to find out what it was. The storm showed no signs of easing as Julia led the group to a small abandoned storefront a few blocks away. The building's awning and doorway offered temporary shelter, shielding them from the pounding rain. The water still pooled around their feet, but it wasn't as high here. Julia knelt by the girl and Max, placing the two smaller puppies beside them. Her arms ached, her clothes were soaked through, and her thoughts were a jumble of relief and dread. She glanced at the metal box Max had retrieved, still clamped tightly in his jaws. "Good job, Max," she said softly, patting the dog's head. "You're a brave little guy." The girl hugged Max tightly, her face buried in his wet fur. "He saved us," she said, her voice muffled. Julia nodded, her gaze fixed on the box. The scratches and dents on its surface told the story of survival, but the mystery of its contents gnawed at her. "What's in here?" she murmured, running her fingers over the rusted lock. Max barked once, a sharp, determined sound that drew Julia's attention. He stepped back from the box, his tail wagging slightly as if encouraging her to open it. Julia glanced at the girl. "You okay if I take a look?" The girl nodded, wiping her eyes. "It's your turn to be brave," she said, her voice small but steady. Julia smiled faintly. "You got me there." She grabbed a small piece of broken metal from the debris scattered around the doorway and wedged it into the lock. The rusted mechanism groaned in protest as she jiggled and pried at it. After a few tense moments, the lock snapped open. Julia paused, her breath catching as she lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of soaked papers, wrapped tightly in what appeared to be a waterproof casing. There was also a small battered device, something electronic, though its purpose wasn't immediately clear. "What is this?" Julia muttered, carefully unwrapping the papers. The girl and Max watched silently as Julia spread the documents on the ground. The writing was blurred in places, but the bold, stamped lettering on the first page sent a chill down her spine. "Property of Larson Biotech Laboratories. Confidential." Julia frowned, flipping through the pages. The words she could make out, experimental testing, hazardous, and evacuation procedures, painted a troubling picture. "What does it mean?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. "I'm not sure," Julia admitted, her eyes narrowing as she picked up the small electronic device. It was waterlogged, but the casing seemed intact. "Whatever it is, it's important enough for someone to hide it in the middle of a storm." Max barked sharply, snapping Julia out of her thoughts. He stood at the edge of the shelter, his body tense as he stared into the darkness. "What is it now?" Julia whispered, following his gaze. The street outside was eerily quiet, the storm's roar muffling all other sounds, but Julia's gut told her something was wrong. The water shimmered faintly, rippling in unnatural patterns that made her skin prickle. "Stay here," Julia said, handing the girl the box. "Keep it safe." The girl's eyes widened. "Where are you going?" Julia tightened her grip on the makeshift metal rod she'd been using for protection. "Max sees something." "I'm going to check it out." Max barked again, his sharp cries echoing through the rain. Julia stepped out into the water, her movements cautious as she scanned the flooded street. "Max, what do you see?" she murmured, her breath fogging in the cold air. The dog growled low, his ears pinned back. Julia followed his gaze to a dark shape moving against the current. At first she thought it was more debris, but then it shifted, rising slightly above the waterline. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't debris, it was alive. The shape moved closer, revealing sleek, black limbs that glistened unnaturally in the dim light. Its movements were smooth but unnatural, almost as if it were gliding through the water. Julia's grip tightened on the rod. "What is that?" she whispered. Max barked furiously, stepping in front of her as the creature emerged fully from the water. Its body was slimy and angular, its glowing yellow eyes locked on Julia with an unsettling intensity. The creature let out a guttural hiss, its limbs spreading wide as it advanced. Julia's heart pounded as she stepped back, her mind racing. "Max, stay behind me," she shouted, raising the rod. But Max had other plans. The little dog lunged forward, barking wildly as he charged at the creature. Julia's shout of protest was drowned out by the storm as Max leaped onto the creature, his teeth sinking into its sleek, rubbery limb. The creature screeched, thrashing violently as it tried to shake Max off. Julia didn't waste a second. She ran forward, swinging the rod with all her strength and striking the creature's side. It hissed again, releasing a spray of foul-smelling liquid as it stumbled back. Max let go, landing in the water with a splash, but the little dog immediately got back on his feet, barking defiantly. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes flicking between Julia and Max. Then, with a final, eerie hiss, it retreated, sinking back into the water and vanishing beneath the surface. Julia stood frozen, her chest heaving as she stared at the spot where the creature had disappeared. "Max," she said breathlessly, crouching down and pulling the dog into her arms. "What were you thinking?" Max wagged his tail, licking her face as if to say, "I had it under control." Julia let out a shaky laugh, hugging him tightly. You're crazy, you know that? She glanced back toward the shelter, where the girl was watching with wide eyes, clutching the box to her chest. Julia stood, her legs shaking as she carried Max back to the safety of the awning. Whatever was going on, it wasn't over. The box, the creature, the strange behavior of the flood, it all felt connected, and Julia knew she was caught in something far bigger than she'd imagined. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. Her words meant as much for herself as for the girl and Max. But even as she spoke, the unease in her chest refused to fade. Julia placed Max gently on the ground, wiping her damp hands on her soaked jeans as she caught her breath. The girl clutched the box tightly, her eyes flicking between Julia and the floodwaters. The storm hadn't let up, and the tension in the air felt almost electric. "What was that thing?" the girl asked, her voice small but steady. Julia shook her head, still shaken by the encounter. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it wasn't normal." Max, unbothered by the storm or the creature, sat proudly beside the girl, his tail wagging. Julia knelt beside him, stroking his wet fur. "You're braver than me, you know that," she whispered. The girl's voice broke through Julia's thoughts. "You think it came because of the box?" Julia hesitated. The idea sounded ridiculous, but the timing was hard to ignore. The creature had appeared as soon as they'd opened the box, and its strange movements had felt purposeful, as though it had been drawn to them. "Maybe," Julia said slowly, her gaze falling to the battered metal box. The girl held it out to her. "Should we see what else is inside?" Julia hesitated. The papers and the strange electronic device had already raised enough questions, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that whatever was in the box might hold the answers they needed. She nodded, taking the box from the girl and carefully placing it on the ground. The storm's steady rhythm filled the silence as Julia peeled back the soaked papers and pulled out the small electronic device again. "This thing," Julia murmured, turning it over in her hands. "It looks like some kind of tracker." Max barked softly, as if agreeing. Julia pressed a button on the side of the device, and to her surprise, a faint green light flickered to life. A soft, rhythmic beep followed, growing faster and louder as she held it closer to the box. "It's responding to something," Julia said, her brow furrowing. The girl leaned closer. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Julia admitted, her voice tight with unease. She set the device aside and reached deeper into the box, pulling out a small, laminated card. The text was faded but still legible. "Emergency protocol. Secure breach signal. Handle with caution." Julia frowned. What kind of breach are they talking about? The girl didn't answer, her attention drawn to Max, who had begun growling softly. Julia followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. The water outside was rippling again, small waves lapping against the edges of the shelter. The ripples were too regular, too purposeful. "They're back," Julia whispered, grabbing the rod she had used earlier. The girl's grip on Max tightened as she whispered, "What do we do?" Julia didn't hesitate. "We need to move. Now." She scooped up the box and the two smaller puppies, tucking them into the crook of her arm. "Stay close to me," she said firmly. Max barked sharply, already leading the way out of the shelter. Julia held the girl's hand tightly as they stepped back into the rain, the cold water swirling around their legs. The street was eerily quiet except for the sound of the storm. Julia's eyes darted to every shadow, her muscles tense. "Where are we going?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Julia glanced around, her mind racing. "We need to find higher ground, somewhere safe." Max barked again, his small body splashing through the water as he led them toward a narrow side street. Julia followed, her legs aching as she pushed against the current. The water was deeper here, the current stronger. Julia gritted her teeth, holding the girl tightly to keep her from stumbling. The two puppies whimpered softly in her arms, their small bodies shivering. Behind them, the ripples in the water grew larger, faster. Julia didn't need to look back to know the creatures were close. "Faster," she urged, her voice tight with urgency. They rounded a corner, and Julia's heart lifted as she saw a low building with a fire escape ladder hanging just above the waterline. "There," she said, pointing. Max barked sharply, already racing toward the ladder. Julia lifted the girl first, helping her grab onto the rungs. "Climb," she said. The girl scrambled up, her small hands gripping the cold metal tightly. Julia followed, holding the box and puppies in one arm while using the other to pull herself up. Just as she reached the second rung, the water beneath them exploded in a spray of mist. Julia turned, her breath catching as one of the creatures emerged. It was larger than the one she'd seen earlier, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on her as it let out a guttural hiss. "Go," Julia shouted, shoving the girl upward. The creature lunged, its jagged limbs slamming into the ladder and shaking it violently. Julia gripped the rungs tighter, her heart pounding as she swung the metal rod at the creature's face. The blow connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature hissed, recoiling slightly. Max barked furiously from above, his sharp cries echoing through the storm. "Not today," Julia muttered, climbing higher. The creature lunged again, its claws raking the air just inches from Julia's feet. She kicked out, her foot striking its head, and it screeched, sinking back into the water. Julia hauled herself onto the roof, gasping for breath. The girl sat nearby, hugging Max tightly, while the two smaller puppies huddled together beside her. For a moment the group sat in silence, the storm's roar filling the air. Julia stared down at the flooded street below, her chest heaving. "They're not going to stop," she said finally, her voice barely audible. The girl looked up, her wide eyes filled with fear. "What do we do now?" Julia set the box down carefully, her jaw tightening. "We find out what's in this thing that's so important," she said, her determination hardening. Max barked once, his tail wagging slightly. Julia gave him a faint smile. "And we make sure they don't get it." The rain pounded relentlessly on the rooftop as Julia sat cross-legged, the battered metal box resting in front of her. Max sat beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the edges of the roof, while the girl huddled nearby, clutching the two smaller puppies. The tension was thick, the storm's fury matching the unease in Julia's chest. "Whatever's in here," Julia said softly, brushing her soaked hair back, "it's important enough for those things to come after us." The girl nodded, her wide eyes flicking between Julia and the box. "Do you think it's dangerous?" Julia hesitated, glancing at the laminated card she found earlier. "Secure breach signal. Handle with caution." "It could be," she admitted, her voice low, "but I think it's more dangerous if we don't figure it out." Max barked once, wagging his tail as if urging her on. Julia took a deep breath and picked up the small electronic device from the box. It was heavier than it looked, its casing battered but still functional. The faint green light blinked steadily, and the soft beeping was rhythmic, almost calming in its consistency. "This thing's tracking something," Julia murmured, turning it over in her hands. "But what?" The girl scooted closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "What if it's tracking those creatures?" Julia's stomach sank. She hadn't considered that possibility, but it made sense. The creatures seemed drawn to the box, as if they could sense it. "I don't think it's tracking them," Julia said after a moment. "I think it's connected to something bigger. Maybe this breach the papers mentioned." She pulled out the soggy documents again, carefully smoothing them against her lap. Most of the text was illegible, but a few fragments stood out. Asterisk dimensional instability. Asterisk containment protocols. Asterisk unauthorized exposure may result in catastrophic consequences. Julia frowned. "This doesn't sound like an accident. Someone knew this would happen." The girl shivered, holding the puppies tighter. "What if the creatures come back?" Julia glanced over the edge of the roof. The water below was calmer now, but the memory of those glowing eyes still sent chills down her spine. "They probably will," Julia said, her voice steady. "But we're not going to wait for them to catch us." Max barked sharply, as if agreeing. Julia stood, grabbing the box and the tracking device. "We need to find whoever's responsible for this. If they created the breach, they might know how to stop it." "Where do we go?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Julia looked at the tracking device. The beeping had grown faster, the green light pulsing more steadily. It seemed to be guiding her somewhere, the faint arrow on the screen pointing northeast. "This thing's leading us somewhere," Julia said, showing the girl the blinking light. "We follow it." The girl hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. But what about the water? We can't go back down there." Julia scanned the rooftops, her mind racing. The storm had flooded the streets, but the buildings were close enough together to offer a possible path forward. "We'll stay up here," Julia said, pointing to a nearby rooftop. "If we can jump to that building, we'll be closer to wherever this is taking us." The girl's eyes widened. "Jump?" Julia gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not as bad as it sounds. I'll go first, then help you across." The girl bit her lip, clutching Max nervously. "Okay," she whispered. Julia approached the edge of the roof, her heart pounding as she gauged the distance. The gap between the buildings was narrow, but the rain made everything slippery and uncertain. "Here goes nothing," she muttered, gripping the box tightly. With a deep breath, Julia leaped, her feet landing on the opposite roof with a thud. She stumbled slightly but regained her balance, exhaling in relief. "Your turn," she called, setting the box down. The girl hesitated, her small hands gripping Max tightly. Julia stretched out her arms, her voice calm. "I've got you. I won't let you fall." The girl nodded, her fear giving way to determination. She stepped to the edge, took a deep breath, and jumped. Julia caught her easily, pulling her to safety. "You did great," she said with a smile. Max was next. The small dog barked once, then leaped across with surprising agility, landing gracefully beside Julia. "You're a natural," Julius said, scratching his ears. The two smaller puppies followed carefully, guided by Julia's steady hands. Once everyone was across, Julia picked up the tracking device and glanced at the screen. The arrow was brighter now, pointing toward the horizon. "Let's keep moving," she said, leading the way. The group hopped from rooftop to rooftop, the rain and wind making every step feel precarious. Julia's muscles burned and her arms ached from carrying the box and puppies, but she refused to slow down. As they reached the edge of the last building, Julia spotted a large warehouse in the distance. The tracking device beeped rapidly, its green light flashing almost frantically. "This is it," Julia said, her voice tense. The girl frowned. "What is it?" Julia stared at the warehouse, her jaw tightening. "I think it's where this all started." Max barked sharply, his small body bristling with alertness. Julia followed his gaze and froze. At the far end of the warehouse, the water rippled unnaturally, glowing faintly in the dark. "They're already here," Julia whispered. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette broken only by flashes of lightning that lit up the sky. Julia stood at the edge of the rooftop, clutching the tracking device as its rapid beeping echoed in her ears. The faint glow in the water near the warehouse sent chills through her, and Max stood by her side, his growls low and steady. "This is where it's leading us," Julia said, her voice firm despite the unease gnawing at her. The girl clutched Max tightly, her small frame trembling. "Do we have to go in there? It looks scary." Julia crouched beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know it does," she said gently, "but whatever's causing all of this, it's in there. If we don't stop it, it'll just get worse." The girl hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but we'll stick together, right?" Julia smiled faintly. "Absolutely. We got this." Max barked sharply, wagging his tail as if to bolster their confidence. Julia led the way down the fire escape, carefully navigating the slippery metal rungs until they reached the flooded street below. The water was still high, swirling around their knees, but Julia's focus was locked on the warehouse ahead. As they approached, the faint glow in the water grew stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat. The tracking device in Julia's hand beeped louder, its green light blinking rapidly. "We're close," Julia murmured, glancing back at the girl. "Stay close to me." The warehouse door was partially ajar, water spilling in through the gap. Julia pushed it open carefully, the metal creaking loudly in the quiet storm. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with the scent of wet concrete and rust. The space was massive, rows of empty shelves stretching into the shadows. Lightning flashed through the broken windows, casting eerie patterns on the walls. The water sloshed around their feet as they stepped inside, each sound echoing unnervingly. Max sniffed the air, his ears pricked and his body tense. He let out a soft growl, his sharp eyes fixed on a faint light at the far end of the warehouse. "There," Julia whispered, following his gaze. At the center of the space, a strange machine hummed faintly, its lights casting an unnatural glow. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from asphalt on a hot day. Julia's grip on the tracking device tightened as she stepped closer. The beeping had become constant now, the green light flashing in sync with the pulses of the machine. "What is that?" the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think it's the breach," Julia said, her tone grim. Max barked sharply, pulling Julia's attention to the shadows near the machine. Movement flickered there, quick, unnatural. Julia froze, her eyes narrowing. "They're here," she said softly. As if in response, the shadows shifted, and one of the creatures stepped into the light. Its jagged, angular form was more defined now, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on Julia and the group. Julia raised the rod she'd been carrying, her muscles tensing. "Stay behind me," she said firmly, glancing at the girl. The creature hissed, its limbs spreading wide as it advanced. Its movements were slow but deliberate, as though it were testing their reactions. Max let out a fierce bark, his small frame bristling with determination. Julia clenched her jaw, taking a step forward. "Not this time," she muttered, gripping the rod tightly. The creature lunged, its jagged limbs slicing through the air. Julia swung the rod, the metal connecting with a loud crack that sent the creature staggering back. "Run," Julia shouted, motioning for the girl to retreat toward a stack of crates. The girl hesitated, clutching Max, then nodded and ran, the two smaller puppies following close behind. The creature recovered quickly, its glowing eyes narrowing as it let out a guttural hiss. Julia stood her ground, her heart pounding as two more creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering unnervingly in the dim light. "Great," Julia muttered under her breath. The creatures moved as one, circling her as though strategizing. Julia's mind raced, searching for an opening. She swung the rod again, forcing one of them back, but the other two pressed closer. Max barked sharply, darting out from behind the crates. He leaped at one of the creatures, his teeth sinking into its jagged limb. The creature screeched, thrashing violently as Max held on. "Max, no!" Julia shouted, panic tightening her chest. But the little dog refused to back down, his fierce determination buying Julia precious seconds. She lunged forward, swinging the rod with all her strength and striking the creature's head. It screeched and dissolved into shimmering particles, leaving Max standing triumphantly in its place. Julia didn't have time to celebrate. The other two creatures were closing in, their movements faster and more coordinated. "Come on," she shouted, grabbing Max and retreating toward the girl. As they reached the stack of crates, Julia's gaze fell on the glowing machine. The shimmering air around it had grown more intense, and the water beneath it swirled unnaturally. The tracking device in her hand beeped frantically, the green light almost blinding. Julia's stomach twisted. The breach was destabilizing. "We have to shut it down," Julia said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "How?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Julia stared at the machine, her mind racing. There has to be a way. Whoever built it must have left a failsafe. Max barked, darting toward the machine. Julia followed, her eyes scanning the control panel. It was a mess of blinking lights and switches, but one lever was marked with a red warning label, "Emergency Override." Julia's heart pounded as she grabbed the lever. The creatures screeched behind her, their movements growing frantic, as though they sensed what she was about to do. "Get ready to run," Julia said, glancing back at the girl. The girl nodded, holding the puppies tightly. Julia pulled the lever with all her strength. The machine let out a deafening hum, the lights flashing wildly as the shimmering air around it collapsed inward. The creatures screeched one final time before dissolving into nothingness, their forms sucked into the imploding breach. The warehouse shook violently, cracks spidering across the walls as the storm outside raged on. Julia grabbed the girl and Max, pulling them toward the exit as the building began to collapse. They burst through the doors just as the warehouse crumbled behind them, the ground shaking beneath their feet. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rain. Julia sank to her knees, gasping for breath as she clutched Max tightly. The girl sat beside her, the puppies huddling close. "Is it over?" the girl whispered. Julia looked back at the ruins of the warehouse, her chest heaving. "I think so," she said softly, though the unease in her chest told her it might not be that simple. Max licked her face, his tail wagging. Julia smiled faintly, scratching behind his ears. "You're one incredible little dog," she murmured. As the rain began to ease, Julia looked out at the horizon, the tracking device silent in her hand. The fight might be over, but the mystery was far from solved. The storm had finally calmed, leaving the streets flooded but eerily quiet. Julia, Max the girl, and the two puppies sat on a dry patch of ground a few blocks away from the collapsed warehouse. The weight of the night hung heavily in the air, but for the first time in hours, it felt like they could catch their breath. Julia stared at the tracking device in her hand. The green light had stopped blinking, the screen blank except for the faint outline of the arrow pointing back to where the warehouse had stood. "It's not beeping anymore," the girl said softly, her voice hesitant. Julia nodded, her fingers tightening around the device. "That's a good thing," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Max sat at her side, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The dog seemed more alert than ever, his ears twitching at every faint sound. Julia scratched behind his ears, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You really don't miss a thing, do you?" The girl leaned against Julia, cradling the two smaller puppies in her lap. "Do you think the creatures are gone?" Julia hesitated. She wanted to reassure the girl, to tell her it was all over, but she couldn't shake the unease in her chest. The breach had been closed, and the creatures had disappeared, but the strange energy lingering in the air told her it wasn't that simple. "I think we stopped them for now," Julia said finally, "but we'll need to figure out where they came from, and why." The girl looked up at her, her wide eyes filled with worry. "What if they come back?" Julia's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready." Max barked softly, his tail wagging as if to agree. Julia glanced at the ruined warehouse in the distance, the collapsed structure barely visible in the gray light of dawn. The storm clouds were beginning to break, the first hints of sunlight cutting through the gloom. "We need answers," Julia said, her voice firm. She pulled the laminated card from the box, the words Larson Biotech Laboratories, still legible despite the water damage. "What's that?" the girl asked, tilting her head. Julia held up the card. "It's a name, Larson Biotech. Whoever they are, they're tied to this. The breach, the creatures, that machine, it all leads back to them." "Do you think they caused this?" the girl asked. Julia nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe they were trying to stop it and things went wrong. Either way, we need to find them." Max stood suddenly, his ears pricked and his body tense. He let out a low growl, his sharp eyes fixed on the road ahead. Julia followed his gaze, her muscles tensing. At first she saw nothing but the flooded street and the scattered debris left by the storm. Then she noticed it, a faint, flickering light in the distance, barely visible against the dawn. "What is that?" the girl whispered, clutching the puppies tightly. Julia stood, gripping the tracking device as she stepped forward. The faint hum that accompanied the light was unmistakable, and her stomach sank. "It's the same glow," Julia said quietly, "like the breach." Max barked sharply, stepping forward as if ready to charge. Julia placed a hand on his back, steadying him. "Not yet, buddy," she said softly. "We need to be smart about this." The girl tugged on Julia's sleeve. "Are we going to check it out?" Julia nodded, her expression grim. "We have to. If there's another breach, we need to stop it before things get worse." With Max leading the way, Julia and the girl moved cautiously toward the flickering light. The air grew colder as they approached, the faint hum growing louder with each step. As they rounded a corner, they saw it. In the center of the flooded intersection stood another machine, identical to the one in the warehouse. Its lights blinked erratically, the shimmering air around it pulsing with energy. Julia's grip on the tracking device tightened. "Another one," she muttered, her heart sinking. The girl clutched Max tightly, her voice trembling. "Why are there more of them?" "I don't know," Julia admitted. She scanned the area, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something unusual near the machine. A man in a lab coat hunched over the control panel. "Wait here," Julia said, her voice low. The girl nodded, crouching behind a nearby stack of debris with the puppies. Max stayed at Julia's side, his growls low but constant. Julia approached carefully, her steps silent despite the water swirling around her feet. The man didn't notice her at first, his attention fully on the machine. He muttered to himself, his hands flying over the controls. "What do you think you're doing?" Julia called out, her voice sharp. The man froze, his head snapping up. He turned slowly, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "I could ask you the same thing," Julia said, stepping closer. "What is this? Why are these machines here?" The man's eyes darted to Max, then back to Julia. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaky. "It's not safe." "No kidding," Julia shot back. "Your machines are tearing open breaches and letting those creatures through. What's going on?" The man hesitated, then sighed heavily. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his shoulders slumping. "We were trying to contain the energy, not release it. But something went wrong." "Contain it?" Julia repeated, her tone skeptical. "You're telling me this is some kind of experiment gone wrong?" The man nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, and if we don't stop it, the breaches will keep spreading." Julia's eyes narrowed. "Then help me shut this thing down." The man hesitated, glancing at the machine. "I can try," he said, "but it's unstable. If I make one wrong move, it could cause an explosion big enough to destroy the entire block." Julia's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "Then you'd better not mess up." Max barked sharply, his tail wagging as if to say, "We've got this." Julia stepped back, her gaze fixed on the flickering machine. Whatever came next, she was ready. The air around the machine crackled with energy, the shimmering distortion growing more unstable with every passing second. Julia stood a few feet away, gripping the tracking device tightly as its faint beep returned, matching the erratic pulse of the breach. The man in the loud coat worked frantically at the control panel, his hands shaking as he adjusted dials and flipped switches. "This breach is worse than the one at the warehouse," he muttered, more to himself than to Julia. "The energy levels are off the charts." "Then fix it," Julia said sharply, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Max stood at her side, his body tense, growling softly as though he could sense something Julia couldn't. "I'm trying," the man snapped, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the cold. "If I stabilize it too quickly, the machine could overload. If I go too slow, the breach will expand." Julia clenched her jaw, glancing back at the girl and the puppies, who were still huddled behind a stack of debris. "We don't have time for second guesses," she said, her voice firm. "If those creatures show up, it's over." As if on cue, a loud hiss echoed through the flooded street. Julia spun around, her heart pounding as the shadows near the far end of the intersection began to shift. "They're here," she whispered. Max barked sharply, stepping forward as two of the creatures emerged from the darkness. Their glowing yellow eyes locked onto Julia, their jagged limbs slicing through the water as they advanced. The man looked up from the control panel, his face pale. "I can't work with those things here." "You'd better learn how," Julia shot back, gripping the metal rod she'd been carrying. She stepped between the man and the creatures, her muscles tensing. "Max, stay close," she said, her voice low. The first creature lunged, its angular form flickering unnervingly as it slashed at Julia. She ducked, swinging the rod with all her strength and striking its torso. The creature hissed, stumbling back but quickly recovering. Max darted toward the second creature, barking furiously as he snapped at its legs. The creature screeched, swiping at the dog, but Max was too fast, dodging its attacks with practiced precision. "Keep them off me," the man shouted, his fingers flying over the control panel. Julia didn't respond, her focus locked on the creatures. The first one lunged again, its glowing eyes narrowing as it aimed for the tracking device in her hand. Julia swung the rod, striking its limb and forcing it back. "You're not getting this," she muttered, her chest heaving. Max let out a sharp bark, his teeth sinking into the second creature's jagged arm. The creature thrashed violently, sending water splashing in all directions. Julia seized the opportunity, slamming the rod into its head. The creature screeched one last time before dissolving into shimmering particles. "Good work, Max," Julia called, but her relief was short-lived. The first creature was still standing, and as Julia turned to face it, she saw two more emerging from the shadows. "Great," she muttered under her breath. The man's voice broke through the chaos. "I've almost stabilized it," he shouted. "Just a few more seconds." Julia gritted her teeth, swinging the rod again as the first creature lunged. The metal connected with its torso, but the impact wasn't enough to stop it. The creature hissed, swiping at Julia and forcing her to stumble back. Max barked furiously, charging at one of the new creatures. The dog's bravery bought Julia precious seconds, but the odds were stacking against them. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster," Julia shouted, her voice edged with panic. The man didn't respond, his focus locked on the control panel. The machine's lights flashed erratically, the hum growing louder as the shimmering distortion around it began to collapse inward. Julia swung the rod again, striking the first creature and finally forcing it to dissolve into particles. But the remaining two were closing in, their glowing eyes fixed on her. "Max, get back," Julia called, her heart racing. The dog darted toward her, his tail wagging slightly despite the danger. "The containment field is almost stable," the man shouted. "But there's a problem." Julia turned, her eyes narrowing. "What kind of problem?" "If I don't release the energy buildup manually, the whole machine will explode," he said, his voice trembling. "Someone needs to pull the override lever while I hold the breech steady." Julia's stomach sank. "Are you saying this thing could blow up the entire area?" The man nodded grimly. "If we don't contain it, yes." Julia glanced at the lever, its red warning label glaring in the dim light. The creatures were closing in, and the hum of the machine was growing deafening. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it. Just tell me when." The man's eyes widened. "You don't understand. Once the lever is pulled, there's no time to get away." Julia's jaw tightened. "Just focus on stabilizing it," she said firmly. Max barked sharply, as if sensing her resolve. Julia crouched beside him, scratching his ears. "You're going to need to look after them," she whispered, nodding toward the girl and the puppies. The dog licked her hand, his tail wagging faintly. "Julia? No," the girl cried, stepping out from behind the debris. Julia turned, her heart aching at the fear in the girl's eyes. "I'll be okay," she said softly, "but you need to stay back." The man's voice broke through the tension. "Now, pull it now." Julia didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the machine, dodging the creatures as she grabbed the lever and yanked it downward. The machine let out a deafening roar, the lights flashing wildly as the distortion around it collapsed completely. Julia turned, her eyes locking on Max and the girl one last time before the explosion ripped through the air. The explosion tore through the air, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Julia felt the shockwave hit her like a freight train, sending her sprawling backward into the flooded street. Her vision blurred as a brilliant light enveloped everything, turning the world into a blinding, chaotic haze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The rain stopped, the hum of the machine faded, and even the creatures seemed to vanish. Julia struggled to breathe, her chest heaving as she tried to push herself up. Her ears rang as the world slowly came back into focus. The faint sound of water dripping and the muffled cries of the girl reached her through the haze. "Julia," the girl screamed, her voice shaking with fear. Julia groaned, her body aching as she forced herself to her knees. Her clothes were soaked and torn, her arms and legs bruised from the impact. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, and saw Max standing a few feet away, his small frame wet but unharmed. "You're okay," Julia whispered, her voice hoarse. She reached out, and Max bounded toward her, licking her face and wagging his tail. The girl ran to her, tears streaming down her face. She knelt beside Julia, wrapping her arms around her. "I thought you were gone." "I'm still here," Julia said softly, pulling the girl into a reassuring hug. The two smaller puppies ran over, yipping and licking Julia's hands as she patted their heads. The warmth of their small bodies was a welcome comfort against the cold. Julia looked around, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. The machine was gone, its remnants scattered across the flooded street. The creatures had vanished too, their glowing forms nowhere to be seen. "It worked," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man in the lab coat staggered out from behind a pile of debris, his face pale and his clothes singed. He looked at Julia, his expression a mix of relief and guilt. You did it," he said, his voice shaking. Julia pushed herself to her feet, her legs wobbling. "What happened to the breach?" The man gestured weakly to the area where the machine had been. "It's gone. The energy was contained before it could expand. The creatures, they were tied to it. Without the breach, they can't survive." Julia exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her. "So it's over?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the tracking device still clutched in Julia's hand. "For now," he said carefully. "But if there are other machines, other breaches..." Julia's stomach sank. "How many are there?" "I don't know," the man admitted. The program was designed to test the energy's containment in controlled environments, but things got out of hand. If other machines are active, they could open new breaches. Julia stared at him, her frustration boiling over. "And you didn't think to stop it before this happened?" "I was trying," the man snapped, his voice cracking. "But the organization behind this, Larson Biotech, they didn't care about the risks. They only saw the potential for power, for profit. When I realized what was happening, it was too late." Julia clenched her fists, anger flashing in her eyes. "So what do we do now?" The man looked down, shame etched into his features. "We find the remaining machines and shut them down." "For good?" Julia glanced at the girl, who was watching the exchange with wide, fearful eyes. She crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I promised you we'd stick together," Julia said softly. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The girl nodded, her expression resolute despite her fear. Max barked sharply, his tail wagging as he looked up at Julia. She smiled faintly, scratching his ears. "And I'm guessing you're all in too." Julia turned to the man. "If we're going to stop this, we'll need more information. Everything you know about Larson Biotech, the machines, the breaches, I need it all." The man nodded. "I'll tell you everything. But we need to move quickly. If there are other active machines, we're running out of time." Julia stood, her strength returning as the adrenaline coursed through her. She looked at Max, the girl, and the puppies, a sense of determination settling over her. "This isn't over," Julia said firmly. "Not until every last one of these machines is gone." As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, the group began to move, the ruins of the breach behind them and an uncertain journey ahead. The sun rose slowly, casting a pale orange glow over the flooded streets. The storm had passed, leaving the air still and heavy. Julia led the way, her wet clothes clinging to her as she clutched the tracking device tightly. Max trotted beside her, his head held high and his tail wagging faintly. The girl walked close behind, holding the two smaller puppies in her arms. Her wide eyes darted nervously to every shadow and flicker of light, but there was a quiet determination in her steps. The man in the lab coat trailed behind them, his expression grim. He carried a small bag he had salvaged from the debris, its contents clinking faintly as he walked. "We're heading to Larson Biotech," Julia said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but her mind was racing. "If they're behind this, they'll have answers, and we'll make sure they shut this down." The man hesitated. "It's not going to be easy," he said. "Larson Biotech isn't just a company. They have resources, security, and they won't want anyone interfering." Julia stopped, turning to face him. "They don't have a choice," she said firmly. "They started this mess, and they're going to help clean it up." The man nodded reluctantly. "There's a Larson facility about 20 miles from here," he said. "It's one of their smaller labs, but it might have the information we need." "Then that's where we're going," Julia said. Max barked, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Julia smiled faintly, crouching to scratch behind his ears. "What do you think, Max? Ready for another adventure?" The dog wagged his tail, his enthusiasm infectious. The group began their journey, weaving through the flooded streets as the sun climbed higher. The storm's destruction was evident everywhere. Collapsed buildings, overturned cars, and debris scattered across the roads. Julia kept her eyes on the tracking device. Though it had stopped beeping, the faint green light pulsed steadily, guiding them toward their destination. "What's it like, the Larson facility?" the girl asked, her voice small but curious. The man glanced at her, his face softening. "It's a high-tech lab. Lots of equipment, lots of security. But if we can get inside, we might be able to find a way to track the other machines." "Other machines," Julia muttered, shaking her head. "How many are we talking about?" The man hesitated. "I don't know the exact number. Maybe 5, maybe 10. Larson was experimenting with multiple prototypes, trying to refine the technology. Julia's jaw tightened. And now it's all out of control. The man nodded grimly. As they walked, Max stopped suddenly, his ears pricking up. He growled low, his body tensing. Julia froze, her grip tightening on the tracking device. "What is it?" she asked softly. Max barked sharply, his gaze fixed on a pile of debris ahead. Julia motioned for the others to stay back as she stepped closer, her muscles taut. The pile shifted slightly and Julia's breath caught. For a moment, she thought it was another creature, but then she saw the source of the movement. A man, injured and half buried beneath the rubble. "Help," the man croaked, his voice weak. Julia dropped to her knees, pulling debris away from him as quickly as she could. Max barked once, standing guard as Julia freed the man from the wreckage. The man was pale and trembling, his clothes torn and soaked. He clutched the small device in his hand, its casing identical to the tracker Julia carried. "Who are you?" Julia asked, her voice firm but not unkind. The man coughed, his eyes darting nervously. I work for Larson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They left me behind when the breach opened. I've been trying to survive ever since." Julia's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about the breaches?" The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to the others. "Everything," he said finally. "I helped design the containment systems. I know how to shut them down." Julia's heart raced. "You can stop this?" The man nodded weakly. "If we get to the main facility, I can access the central control system. It's the only way to deactivate the remaining machines at once." Julia exchanged a glance with the man in the lab coat, whose expression was skeptical but intrigued. "Can we trust him?" the girl asked softly. Julia studied the injured man for a moment, then nodded. "We don't have a choice," she said. "If he knows how to stop this, we're taking him with us." The man nodded gratefully, though his eyes were still clouded with fear. "You don't understand how dangerous Larson is," he said. "They won't let you walk into their facility without a fight." Julia smirked faintly. "They haven't met me yet." Max barked sharply, as if in agreement, his tail wagging. The group pressed on, their resolve strengthened by the promise of answers and the weight of the task ahead. The road was long, the danger far from over, but together they were determined to see it through. The fight wasn't finished, not yet.